Well, you know her for a long time, Hi, so I don't have to accomplish any introduction of the phone.
History says Ed Sullivan signed off for the last time in June of 1971. But television history doesn't always tell the truth. It tells the version that's easiest to explain. Behind the scenes, the ending was already set in motion weeks earlier, quietly and deliberately. No announcement, no warning, and no chance for Ed Sullivan to control his own goodbye. What makes this story unsettling isn't just how the show ended, it's how carefully the real ending was hidden. A full broadcast, a live stage, a packed lineup, all recorded under the illusion that everything was business as usual. What if the true final episode wasn't lost, just buried? And what if it's only now being brought back into the light? Stay tuned to find out. How Ed Sullivan was formed. Born in September 1901 to Elizabeth and Peter Sullivan, Edward Vincent Sullivan was lucky to survive childhood at all. Life hit hard and early. His twin brother, Daniel, died just months after they were born. And not long after that, the family lost a younger sister too. That kind of loss could break a family, but instead of staying stuck in grief, the Sullivans made a choice. They packed up what they had and started over in Port Chester, New York, hoping fresh air and new streets could give them a fresh life. And somehow, it worked. Despite everything, the Sullivan house wasn't heavy or quiet. It was alive. Music floated through the rooms every day, with the family crowded around the piano or the phonograph, singing together like that was their therapy. It was loud, messy, and full of joy, and that sound stayed with Ed for the rest of his life. Music might have filled the house, but Ed's own talents were pulling him somewhere else. He loved to downplay himself, joking that his older sister Helen got all the brains and calling her disgustingly brilliant. But that was classic Ed, deflecting. In reality, he was a force. At school, he dominated everything athletic, stacking championships in baseball, basketball, football, and track. From early on, it was clear he had something special. The only thing was, nobody could have guessed where that something would eventually take him. Years later, people would look back and label Ed Sullivan a civil rights advocate, and not without reason. His show would go on to break barriers, but that mindset didn't suddenly appear when the cameras turned on. It had been living in him for years. As a kid, he traveled to Connecticut and spent time in clubs where black performers were not only welcomed, but celebrated. To him, that environment wasn't political or rebellious. It was just normal life. So when he later refused to bend to sponsors or network executives who wanted him to play it safe, he wasn't trying to make a statement. He was just being himself, and he wasn't changing for anybody. At his core, Ed believed people were people, no matter what they looked like or where they came from. That belief never wavered. But when it came to judging talent, that was a whole different story. He had opinions, strong ones, and he wasn't shy about using them. Right around the time he was finishing school, Ed made a decision that almost rewrote the future of entertainment. He ran away from home, not to chase fame or adventure, but to join the U.S. Navy. The plan didn't work out. He was only 17, and they sent him right back home. Without knowing it, the Navy had just turned away a teenager who would one day shape American culture. With the military off the table, Ed leaned into what he knew best: sports. He bounced from paper to paper, writing and editing as a sports columnist, sharpening his voice and learning how to command attention with words. Then came the break that changed everything. He landed a column at the New York Daily News, but instead of just covering games, he started writing about Broadway, nightlife, and celebrities. That column gave him a new kind of power, and Ed felt it immediately. Add a radio show to the mix, and suddenly he wasn't just reporting on culture, he was shaping it. From the legendary El Morocco nightclub, his words could turn an opera singer into a star, or knock a socialite straight out of the spotlight. By the time he hit his stride, Ed Sullivan was already a kingmaker in New York. But just as he reached the top of that world, a new one was being built right in front of him. Television was coming, and it was about to turn Ed Sullivan from a powerful critic into a household name, and eventually, a legend. Television's most dangerous nice guy. By the late 1940s, a strange new invention was creeping into American living rooms and quietly changing everything. Television. Families were gathering around glowing boxes like it was magic, and the hype was impossible to ignore. Producers were calling it the future, saying its potential was as big as the country itself. Ed Sullivan, though, wasn't impressed. He had already conquered newspapers, radio, and nightlife. To him, TV looked like a fad, not a revolution. But one man saw it differently. A producer named Marlo Lewis was convinced Ed Sullivan belonged on that screen. He believed Ed's power wasn't in charm or looks, but in his instincts. So, in early 1948, Lewis made him an offer, his own variety show, Toast of the Town. Sullivan's response was ice cold. He brushed it off, saying they were promising him things he'd already done before. For a moment, it seemed like the idea was dead on arrival. Then, something shifted. Nobody knows exactly what changed his mind, but by June of that same year, Sullivan said yes. The show went into production, and history quietly started turning. It wouldn't be called The Ed Sullivan Show just yet. And truth be told, the early days were rough, really rough. And not just for the show, for Ed himself. When the cameras first turned on, he froze. Actors could stare into the lens like it wasn't there, but Ed felt like those cameras were staring straight through him. His body locked up, his face stiffened, and suddenly he looked like a man who'd been carved out of stone. Critics noticed immediately. They didn't just dislike him, they went after him. Hard. Some begged CBS to fire him outright. Others openly questioned why he was even on television in the first place. They compared him to statues, monuments, and mannequins. His smile was mocked. His posture was mocked. Even the way he moved got dragged through the papers. By 1949, he had earned a cruel nickname that followed him everywhere, the Great Stone Face. The reviews were so brutal that his daughter eventually stopped reading newspapers altogether. Rumors even started spreading that Ed had a steel plate in his head. Hundreds of people wrote him letters praising his courage for working through such a supposed disability. Ed just shook his head at the whole thing. He never believed he was the attraction anyway. In his mind, the show was always about the acts, not him. Even when the program moved into prime time, the critics wouldn't let up. One famous columnist claimed Ed didn't get famous by having a personality, but by having none at all. That line hit a nerve, and Ed fired back with a response so sharp it became legend. It was the first public glimpse of something most people didn't expect from the stiff man on screen: a nasty temper. Because behind the awkward pauses and hunched shoulders was a man who could explode at any moment. And yet, while critics were sharpening their knives, families across America were falling in love with the show. Sunday nights became sacred. Living rooms went quiet when Ed stepped on stage. Years later, one magazine would say that while governments fell and generations passed, Ed Sullivan's stage still stood. That raised a big question. Why did people love him so much? The answer was simple and strange at the same time. Ed Sullivan wasn't a star. He couldn't sing, dance, or crack jokes. He didn't have movie star looks or smooth charisma. He was awkward. He was stiff. He looked like the kind of man you'd see standing next to you in line at the grocery store. And that was exactly the point. People trusted him because he felt like them. His strange movements, his hunched shoulders, the way he wandered the stage like he wasn't quite sure where to stand. None of it was polished. Viewers even wrote in, worried that he was ill, praising him for pushing through what they assumed was a serious condition. But there was no illness. That was just Ed being Ed. Most of the time, his quirks didn't matter. He was too busy introducing the biggest stars in the world. But every now and then, things went off the rails. Once, while trying to gesture toward a hypnotist, he accidentally poked the man in the eye. It was awkward, clumsy, and completely on brand. Critics kept roasting his looks, his walk, his voice, everything. But over time, something shifted. They began to realize that his ordinariness was his superpower. One comedian who appeared on the show summed it up perfectly. Ed did nothing, but somehow he did it better than anyone else on television. Eventually, even Ed leaned into the joke. He encouraged comedians to make fun of him. He loved hearing them exaggerate his stiffness, his posture, that nasal voice. On the surface, it looked like he had thick skin, but guests quickly learned that wasn't true. Off camera, Ed Sullivan had a legendary temper. Biographers described him as thin-skinned, explosive, and always ready for a fight. Years of covering boxing had taught him how to hold a grudge like a prize fighter. Even Ed admitted it himself. He flared up fast, then spent the rest of his time apologizing. But before the apologies came the damage. One of his most infamous blow-ups came with rock and roll pioneer Bo Diddley. Sullivan was strict about control. Songs were chosen ahead of time, and nobody was supposed to improvise. For one appearance, he ordered Diddley to perform 16 tons instead of his own hit, Diddley Daddy. Diddley agreed, at least on paper. During rehearsal, he played the approved song perfectly, but when the cameras rolled that night, he changed the plan. He launched straight into his own hit, and chaos erupted behind the scenes. Executives scrambled to fix the schedule because the new song ran long. 2 acts had to be cut entirely just to keep the show on time. When the cameras went dark, the real fight started. Diddley later said the tension was thick enough to choke on. Sullivan was furious. To him, the switch was a betrayal. He believed changes like that had to be handled before the show, not live on air. The argument exploded, and according to Diddley, Sullivan crossed a line that night, screaming that he would make sure Diddley never worked in television again. And this time, Ed meant it. Whether his anger was about control, ego, or something deeper, nobody can say for sure. What is clear is that the man famous for giving black artists a platform showed no mercy that night. Bo Diddley was banned from the show forever. And he wouldn't be the last legend to learn what happened when you crossed Ed Sullivan, when Ed Sullivan turned cold. In the world of show business, nobody held a grudge quite like Ed Sullivan. When he fell out with Bo Diddley, it wasn't just a quiet ban from the show, it came with a twist of the knife. Diddley later said Sullivan never paid him for the performance at all. He was owed, and the money never came. That detail alone adds a new layer to the Ed Sullivan story, because it forces you to look closer at the man behind the microphone. What makes it even more complicated is that this kind of beef had nothing to do with race. If anything, Sullivan's legacy proves the opposite. At a time when most TV variety shows played it safe by booking only a few acceptable black superstars, Sullivan was doing something different. Sure, America was comfortable seeing legends like Louis Armstrong, Pearl Bailey, and Sammy Davis Jr., but Sullivan wanted more than just the familiar names. Back in the early 1950s, long before it was popular or safe, he was pulling lesser-known black performers straight out of Harlem clubs and putting them on national television. He didn't care that sponsors complained, and they did complain, constantly. Wealthy advertisers were scandalized over things that seem harmless today, like Sullivan kissing Pearl Bailey on the cheek or shaking Nat King Cole's hand. To them, it was too much. To Sullivan, it was common decency, and he had no patience for anyone who thought otherwise. His biographers point to moments where his temper nearly cost him everything. One time, a Ford executive stormed into the theater and told him to stop booking so many black acts. Sullivan didn't argue. He physically threw the man out of the building. Another time, a Cleveland car dealer complained about how close Sullivan stood to the legendary Bill Bojangles Robinson, questioning why Ed put his arm around him after a dance number. That was all it took. Sullivan had to be held back to keep him from attacking the guy. Most days, Ed kept his anger in check, but it was always right there, bubbling under the surface, waiting for a spark. And plenty of performers found out what happened when that fuse got lit. Buddy Holly and the Crickets learned the hard way. It started over something small, The lyrics to Oh Boy, which Sullivan thought were a little too suggestive for 1950s television. He asked them to switch songs. Buddy Holly refused. From that moment on, the tension was thick. When the band showed up late for rehearsal, Sullivan couldn't help himself. He took a shot, saying he guessed the Crickets weren't too excited to be there. Buddy fired right back, saying he hoped they were more excited than he was. That was the wrong move. Sullivan cut their performance time in half. Then, during the live broadcast, he deliberately mispronounced Buddy Holly's name. As if that wasn't enough, he had the crew turn off Holly's guitar amp for the entire song, only switching it on during the solo. It was petty, it was calculated, and it was pure Ed Sullivan. But musicians weren't the only ones who felt his wrath. One night, during one of Sullivan's tightly timed broadcasts, comedian Jackie Mason was in the middle of his set when Ed gave him the wrap-it-up signal. The gesture was so obvious that viewers at home thought Mason was bombing. Mason panicked. Trying to save the moment, he shouted that he was getting fingers, then started throwing hand gestures of his own, yelling that, "Here's a finger for you." At one point, his hand dipped off camera. Nobody knows for sure if he actually flipped Sullivan off. But to Ed, it didn't matter. The damage was done. Later, Sullivan brought Mason back for what he called a surprise reunion, telling the audience they were old pals. But behind the scenes, it was just a formality. Mason was never invited back again. That single moment quietly wrecked his career. His earning power was cut in half, and he didn't truly recover until his Broadway comeback in 1986. But Jackie Mason wasn't the only one who managed to get under Ed Sullivan's skin. The Doors did it too, and they did it in a way that felt almost deliberate. When the band was booked to perform Light My Fire, Sullivan's team asked them to clean up the lyrics, just to make it a little more family-friendly for television. The band nodded, smiled, and acted like they were on board. But the moment they stepped on stage, they sang the original version anyway. Sullivan was furious. The second the cameras cut, he sent a producer backstage with a message that was meant to end the conversation for good. The band had been wanted for 6 more shows, but that door was now closed forever. Jim Morrison didn't flinch. Calm as ever, he brushed it off, saying they had already done the Ed Sullivan Show. And in his mind, that was all that really mattered. That was the thing about Sullivan. If you stayed in his good graces, your career could be set for life. But getting there was a battle. Even Elvis Presley, the man who would soon be crowned the king of rock and roll, had to fight his way onto that stage. At first, Sullivan wanted nothing to do with him. Elvis's image was too wild, too sexual, too risky for a family show. Those hips alone were enough to make executives nervous. By the time Sullivan finally came around, Elvis had already torn through other TV shows and was becoming impossible to ignore. Rival programs were cashing in on his popularity, and Sullivan's team knew they were falling behind. Eventually, the pressure got too loud. A deal was signed for 3 appearances, and Elvis was officially booked. But the first night was pure chaos. Elvis wasn't even in New York. He was in Los Angeles filming Love Me Tender, performing remotely through the magic of television. And Sullivan himself wasn't there either. He was laid up, recovering from a car accident. The show was instead hosted by the English actor Charles Laughton, which only added to how strange the whole thing felt. Still, when Elvis appeared, the moment hit hard. He was just 21 years old, standing in front of America, calling it the greatest honor of his life before launching into Don't Be Cruel. Then came Hound Dog, and that's where everything exploded. That song had always divided people. Fans loved it, but critics absolutely hated it. This was the track where Elvis really leaned into his movements, the same ones that had earned him the nickname Elvis the Pelvis. A few months earlier, he had performed it on The Milton Berle Show, and the reaction was so intense that newspapers ran warnings telling people to beware of Elvis Presley. The outrage only grew from there. Religious leaders joined the pile-on, calling his music and his dancing a sign that the country's morals were collapsing. To them, Elvis wasn't just a singer. He was proof that rock and roll was corrupting the youth. That was the storm waiting for him when he stepped onto the Ed Sullivan Show. And when the broadcast ended, the backlash got physical. In cities like Nashville, crowds gathered in the streets, not to cheer, but to burn and hang effigies of him. It was ugly, loud, and impossible to ignore. But controversy had a funny way of working in Elvis's favor. Every angry headline only made him bigger. The criticism kept him in the spotlight, and the spotlight made him a star. While Sullivan helped take Elvis to another level, he wasn't the one who discovered him. That discovery would come later, in a completely different place, during a chance encounter at London's Heathrow Airport. And when it happened, it would shake the world even harder. Beetlemania was coming. When the Beatles finally stepped onto Ed Sullivan's stage, they handed him the biggest ratings of his entire career. For a moment, it felt like lightning had struck twice. Sullivan loved them for it, no question. But not long after, something else started to show. He was forgetting their names, and that wasn't unusual for him. Ed Sullivan had always been known for having a shaky memory, and as the years went on, it only got worse. Mo Howard from the Three Stooges once pointed this out, saying that while Ed was a good man, he was also surprisingly forgetful for someone who lived in front of cameras. During the Stooges' first appearance, Sullivan even introduced them as the Three Ritz Brothers. He caught himself at the last second, joking that they looked more like the Three Stooges, but the mistake was already out there. It didn't stop there. Diana Ross and the Supremes were some of his most frequent guests, and by all accounts, they were among his favorites. But even they couldn't escape his fading recall. Diana later revealed that Ed never seemed to get their names right. Instead, he'd just call them the girls, as if that was easier than trying to keep it all straight. By 1971, the magic was gone. After years of slipping ratings, the network finally pulled the plug on the Ed Sullivan Show. Television was changing, and the executives were desperate to attract younger audiences. Old programs were being wiped away, one by one, and Sullivan's show was caught in that purge. He took it personally. So personally, in fact, that he refused to host the final 3 months of the season. The network had no choice but to fill the time with reruns. Once the show ended, everything started to fall apart. Sullivan's health declined quickly, and with it, his connection to the moments that once defined his life. Stories began to surface that made it clear just how far he'd slipped. Paul McCartney later shared a quiet, painful memory of running into Sullivan not long after the show was canceled. Ed didn't recognize him at all. He smiled politely, shook his hand, and walked away, treating one of the men who had changed his career like a complete stranger. In 1974, doctors diagnosed Sullivan with esophageal cancer. Given his habits over the years, the diagnosis didn't come as a huge surprise. What did come as a surprise was what his family decided next. They chose not to tell him. They believed there was no point, because his memory was already so fragile that he might forget the news moments after hearing it. Less than a month later, Ed Sullivan was gone. And just like that, the man who once introduced the world to legends slowly faded away himself, slipping quietly into history. Ed Sullivan's final TV broadcast was never aired until now. If you look this up online, most sites will tell you Ed Sullivan's final show aired on June 6, 1971. And yeah, technically that's true, but that version of the story skips the part that actually matters, the part that makes the ending sting. Here's what really happened. CBS officially announced the cancellation of The Ed Sullivan Show on Tuesday, March 30th, 1971. But 2 nights earlier, on Sunday, March 28th, Ed had walked off that stage thinking it was just another episode. No warning, no heads up, no goodbye. He had no idea he'd just filmed the last original show of his career. That's the part people don't talk about. In broadcasting, this move is cold, but it's common. Networks are terrified of giving a fired host one last live microphone. They worry the host might go off script, air grievances, or call out executives on the way out. So instead of risking it, They shut everything down quietly. No farewell, no moment, just silence. And for a man like Ed Sullivan, who had spent nearly 25 years bringing America together every Sunday night, that silence hurt. He was furious. More than that, he was wounded. He felt betrayed by CBS, not just for canceling the show right before its 25-year anniversary, but for how they handled it. He later called the whole thing shabby, and he never really let it go. After that final live-to-tape episode was recorded, CBS quietly filled the time slot with reruns from the same season. They stretched those repeats out until June 6, 1971, letting the show fade away without ever telling viewers the truth. But the history books don't lie. The last original Ed Sullivan Show, episode 1068, aired on March 28, 1971. That night, the stage was still alive. Melanie performed, Joanna Simon sang, Danny Davis and the Nashville Brass brought their sound. Sandler and Young added comedy to the mix. It looked like just another classic Sunday night, but behind the scenes, the door had already closed. When June 6th finally came, the curtain dropped for good. That final airing was a rerun from February, and it was stacked with talent. Gladys Knight and the Pips lit up the stage with If I Were Your Woman and Bridge Over Troubled Water. Jerry Vale sang I Want to Make It With You. Caterina Valente performed The Girl from Ipanema. Peter Nero played the love story theme on piano. The theater crowd got their moment too, with Sid Caesar and Carol Channing performing a scene from 4 on a garden. The laughs kept coming from Robert Klein and Pat Henry. And then it was over. No goodbye. No speech, no final bow, just a quiet ending to one of the most important shows in television history.